Hello everyone, today we are going to talk about the anatomy of our skeletal bones. First, let's talk about functions of bones. Why do we have bones? Well, bones give us a structural support. They do protect us. So if you think of your rib cage, for example, it's protecting your lungs and your heart. If you think of your skull, it's protecting your brain. So bones do definitely give us protection. Your skeletal muscles are attached to the bones. So when your muscles do contract and relax, they're attached to your bones, so it's going to help us move. Our bones also contain bone marrow. We have two types of bone marrow. We have red bone marrow and we have yellow bone marrow. Yellow bone marrow is going to be helpful for fat storage, and the red bone marrow is going to be helpful for the blood cell formation. So within our red bone marrow, this is where we make our red blood cells, white blood cells, our platelets, which help us clot our blood. All of this is going to be made within the red bone marrow, and the red bone marrow is usually stored within our spongy bone, and we're going to talk about where do we have spongy bone. We have some minerals within our bones, such as calcium and phosphorus, and having calcium in our bones actually gives strength to our bones. So if we do not have enough calcium, our bones get weaker and therefore more susceptible to getting fractured. We talked about how your bones contain the red bone marrow. And within the red bone marrow, this is where the red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets are going to be formed. The process of making those blood cells, it's known as hematopoiesis. Poiesis meaning formation, and heme meaning blood. So hematopoiesis means formation of blood cells. The yellow bone marrow, this is where we are going to store fat. And fat is good because it's a good energy source when you break it down. Now, when we talk about our bones, especially wherever we have joints, we have a piece of cartilage that's going to be between our bones. And having a piece of cartilage between our bones, especially where we have joints, is really helpful because it will prevent your bones from rubbing against each other, which is going to be very, very painful. And so we do have different types of cartilages: hyaline cartilage, fibrocartilage, and elastic cartilage. Most of the blue cartilage that you are seeing right here, and we have a whole lot of it when it comes to our joints, that's the hyaline cartilage. We do have fibrocartilage in between our vertebral column. We call them your discs. So those discs are made out of fibrocartilage. Now, cartilage is usually covered by a connective tissue membrane known as perichondrium. If we break it down, peri meaning around and chondrium meaning cartilage. So the perichondrium, it's a double-layered connective tissue that's surrounding the cartilage. Now, the importance of having that perichondrium surrounding the cartilage is the perichondrium contains lots of blood vessels, and cartilage is avascular. So for cartilage to stay alive, it does need nutrition, and since it does not have its own blood vessels, the cartilage is going to depend on the perichondrium. Since the perichondrium has blood vessels, so the nutrients within the perichondrium can start diffusing into the cartilage. But the cartilages that are located in between our bones, so basically within our joints, those cartilages are not surrounded by a layer of perichondrium. We can classify our bones based on their shape. So we have long bones, such as the bones of your arms, your legs, even your fingers and your toes are considered long bones. Why? Even though your fingers and your toes are not as long as your arm or your leg bones, since the length As long as the length is more than the width of a bone, we consider it a long bone. So the length of your fingers, it's more compared to the width of your fingers, and so therefore it's considered a long bone. Short bones are, for example, your ankle bones, those are short bones. Your wrist bones are short bones. Flat bones, examples of flat bones, your sternum, which is basically your breastbone. Irregular bones, they kind of have an irregular shape to them, so we can consider like your pelvic is an irregular bone. Your vertebra are definitely irregular bones. When we take a look at the bone structure, we have two textures of bones, compact and spongy. Compact is the outer layer, and it's usually smooth and it's pretty hard and solid. The spongy bone, you can either call it trabecular bone or cancellous bone. It kind of looks like a honeycomb. And so that honeycomb look, we call it trabecular. And right here, you can kind of see that honeycomb look. That would be the spongy bone or the trabecular bone. And we usually have the spongy bone sandwiched in between two layers of compact bone. So here's the compact bone. You can kind of see how smooth and solid it is. And so whenever you're looking at a bone, that outer layer that you're looking at is the compact bone. For you to see the spongy bone, you have to split it open and take a look inside of the bone, and that's where you would find the spongy bone. So if you're looking at a skull, the skull is made out of two layers, as you can see right here, of the compact bone, and inside would be the spongy bone. Now, again, you will only see the spongy bone only if you crack the skull open. Otherwise, all you would be seeing from the exterior surface, you would only be seeing the compact bone. But if you go ahead and split it open, you will find the spongy bone inside of it. And as I said, the spongy bone can have several names, cancellous, trabecular, or even diploid. And especially that name, diploid, it's only for the spongy bone within our skull. This is the structure of a long bone, so definitely your skull is not a long bone. Your skull is considered a flat bone, so it's not going to have those features. So those features that I'm going to talk about right now are only included within long bones. So a long bone usually have two ends, a proximal end and a distal end. Proximal meaning that it's closer to the point of origin, and distal, it's further away from the point of origin. So we call the ends epiphyses. So you have the proximal epiphysis and the distal epiphysis. And usually at these ends, you have a piece of cartilage. Why should you have a piece of cartilage? Because you are going to have a joint right here. So this part of the bone is going to be connected to another bone. So you're going to have a joint, and to prevent your bones from frictioning and rubbing against each other, it is pretty important to have a piece of cartilage. We call it articular cartilage because when your bones connect, we refer to that as articulation. So articulation is when you have connection between your bones. That articular cartilage that you are seeing right here, it's actually hyaline cartilage. And as we said, whenever you have cartilage at regions where you're going to have joints, that piece of cartilage is not going to be surrounded by the perichondrium. All of this exterior part of the bone is going to be the compact bone. If you go ahead and split it open, you are going to see the spongy bone on the inside. The shaft of the bone, which is this region right here, the shaft, we refer to it as diaphysis. So you have the two ends, the proximal and distal epiphysis, and then you have that middle portion, the shaft, which is the diaphysis. You can see the compact bone on the exterior, And then if you split the bone open, you will see the spongy bone on the inside. There's usually right here, kind of in between your epiphysis and your diaphysis, there's this region right here. This is what we call your epiphyseal line. Now, we are actually going to talk about how did we get that line, but before being called epiphyseal line, in this region right here, we actually used to have a piece of cartilage, and that piece of cartilage, we refer to it as your growth plate or your epiphyseal plate. And that plate, it's made out of cartilage, and it's what's going to help us grow taller. As we age, we start losing that piece of cartilage that's going to be right there, and it's going to ossify, meaning it's going to turn into bone, and all what you're going to be left with is what we refer to as the epiphyseal line. So this bone right here has already finished its growth, and that's why you don't see the epiphyseal growth plate anymore. So that's why you're not seeing any cartilage in here, and all what you're seeing is just some bone in this region, and we refer to it as your epiphyseal line. Again, we are going to talk about the process of how we grow taller and what happens eventually to that epiphyseal growth plate. There is, in the middle of the diaphysis, there is usually a cavity, and this cavity is known as the medullary cavity. And this is where we have our yellow bone marrow. So if you look right here, within the medullary cavity, this is where we have our yellow bone marrow. And the yellow bone marrow, as I said, this is where we store our fat. Lining the medullary cavity, there's actually a thin membrane known as the endosteum, which we will talk more about. But the endosteum is basically lining that medullary cavity on the inside. There's also another layer known as the periosteum. Peri meaning around, osteum, whenever you guys see the word osteum, osteum meaning bone. So that periosteum is a membrane that's protecting the compact bone. You don't have periosteum at the bone ends, since we have that articular cartilage. So wherever you have articular cartilage, you're not going to have that periosteum. And you can kind of see it right here. See this membrane right here that's kind of being pulled off the compact bone? That is the periosteum. Where do we have our red bone marrow? The red bone marrow is going to be right here within the spongy bone. You can have red bone marrow at both ends, the proximal end and within the distal end. And so red bone marrow is usually within the spongy bone regions, especially the epiphyses ends of your bones. We also have red bone marrow in the spongy bone of our skull. So wherever you have spongy bone, this is where we can have our red bone marrow. There are regions where we have more active red bone marrow compared to other regions. So we have very active red bone marrow within our skull, and we also have very active red bone marrow within the spongy bones of your hips. The yellow bone marrow is within the medullary cavity. This is just a more zoomed in image on one of the epiphyses ends of our long bones. So here is the articular cartilage, which is made out of hyaline cartilage, and then you see the compact bone right here, and the compact bone is the part of the bone that looks like tree trunks when you look at it under the microscope. It's that tough outer layer. And then right here, the layer that kind of looks like honeycomb, that would be the spongy bone. Notice how the blood vessels are going to be embedded within your bones. We do need blood vessels to be within our bones because your bones are made out of cells, and those cells are alive, and so for them to stay alive, they need nutrition. So they definitely need blood vessels. And so you can see that the blood vessels within the spongy bones, they make their way through these gaps within the spongy bone. But because the compact bone is very compacted and it's very dense, there are actually canals, passageways within the compact bone to allow the blood vessels and nerves to pass through. Since the compact bone does not have those gaps that the spongy bones have. So let's talk about that periosteum. So as I said, peri meaning around and osteum meaning around the bone. Now the periosteum, you are going to find it covering the external surfaces of the bone. So it's basically covering the compact bone. And you're not going to find it at the joint surfaces because, as we said earlier, at the joint surfaces you are going to have a piece of cartilage, and so therefore you don't need that periosteum. The periosteum is actually made up of two layers, an outer layer and a deep layer. The outer layer, the very out layer of the periosteum, is known as the fibrous layer, and it's actually made up of a dense, irregular connective tissue. And we have what's known as the Sharpie's fibers, and you can kind of see them right here. Those white, you can either call them perforating fibers or Sharpie's fibers. And those fibers, they actually help secure the periosteum to the compact bone layer. So it kind of helps stick. Here's the periosteum. You can see it right here. Here's the periosteum. And so for that periosteum to stick to the surface of the bone, to stick to the compact bone, we have those Sharpie's fibers that kind of help cling that periosteum layer to the compact bone. So the outer part of the periosteum is that fibrous layer. The inner layer of the periosteum, again, it's really hard to kind of make out the two layers of the periosteum just by looking at this image right here, because again, like those two layers, they are really closely connected to each other, like you don't have any gaps between them. But the inner layer of the periosteum is known as the osteogenic layer. That osteogenic layer actually contains stem cells known as osteogenic cells. What's cool about stem cells is stem cells can actually differentiate, meaning that they can turn themselves into whatever cell you want them to be, as long as they are in the correct region, and as long as they are getting the correct nutrition, etc. They can actually turn and differentiate into whatever special cell they are supposed to turn into. And so those osteogenic cells, those stem cells within the periosteum, they are actually going to turn into bone cells. Why bone cells? To help you regenerate your compact bone if your compact bone goes through any damages. So if you think about it, your bones do get damaged over time, even if you do not break them. So even if you never, let's say you've never broken a bone, just by using your bones every single day, you are putting stress on your bones. And so your compact bone is actually going to start getting damaged over time, and we have to regenerate it. And the reason why we need to regenerate it, because otherwise your bones are just going to get weaker and weaker, and they will be susceptible to fracturing. And so we actually regenerate our compact bone, so we make a new layer of compact bone every 10 years. So every 10 years you actually make a new layer of the compact bone. And so to make that new layer of compact bone, you need cells that are going to be able to regenerate that compact bone for you. And so therefore, having those stem cells that can give rise to those bone cells that will help you create a new bone matrix is extremely important. You can see that the periosteum does have pores, like it does have holes within it, and the blood vessels and nerves can actually pass through these pores within the periosteum, and they can actually um, delve into your compact bone and into your spongy bone. I think also that periosteum is pretty important, not only because it has stem cells that will help you regenerate your bone, and not only because it's like allowing blood vessels to pass through into your bones, but also having that periosteum is important because it acts as an anchoring point for tendons and ligaments. What's the difference between a tendon and a ligament? A tendon is what holds bones to muscles. Ligaments are what hold bones to bones. We talked about the periosteum, right? That layer that's protecting and surrounding your compact bone. Now, what's the layer lining the inside of your bones? We call it endosteum. Endo coming from the term inside. Endo, inside. So endosteum, that's another connective tissue membrane, and it's actually going to be lining the internal bone surfaces. So it's going to be lining any cavities you have deep inside of your bones. It's going to line any like cavities, canals. It's going to line your spongy bone. Endosteum also contains osteogenic cells. Again, what are osteogenic cells? Osteogenic cells are stem cells. So, as we said, your bones go through damage. And we said that having that periosteum with the stem cells within it can help you regenerate your compact bone. Well, does your spongy bone also go through damage? Yes, your spongy bone also gets weaker over time, and so you do want stem cells to help you regenerate your spongy bone. So having that endosteum layer really close to your spongy bone and having stem cells within it, those stem cells, one more time, are going to differentiate into those bone cells. And we're going to talk about the name of those bone cells in just a few, but those bone cells are going to help regenerate the spongy bone for you. I was saying that every 10 years or so, we regenerate our compact bone. We regenerate our spongy bone every 3 to 4 years. Our red bone marrow is located within our spongy bone. There are certain regions where we have very highly active red bone marrow, such as the spongy bone within our skull and our spongy bone within our pelvic bones, which are your hip bones, and your vertebral column. So therefore, when someone needs a bone marrow transplant, we usually get it from those regions that have highly active red bone marrow. Red bone marrow is what's going to help us produce our blood cells, so our red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. A yellow bone marrow, this is where we store our fat. In the yellow bone marrow, in adult bones, it's located within the medullary cavities of our long bones. That's where we have our yellow bone marrow. Now, in case someone, let's say, has severe anemia, so if someone has severe anemia, what they are suffering from is low oxygen levels in their blood. Having a good production of red blood cells is going to help out because your red blood cells can help you transport oxygen. So if someone has severe anemia and they don't have enough oxygen and they are not basically producing, let's say, enough red blood cells, what could happen in this case is that some of their yellow bone marrow can actually turn itself, like it can go through some sort of a conversion and it converts into the red bone marrow. because once it converts to red bone marrow, that red bone marrow can make more red blood cells and therefore transport more oxygen. There are certain bone markings um, to know. So whenever you see these bone markings right there, that would tell you that those are sites where muscles are going to attach. This is where ligaments are going to attach. So, for example, if you're looking at your femur, and this region right here within your femur, it's known as the trochanter. So when you see trochanter, when you see crest, when you see the term spine, all a process, all of these terms are basically points of attachment. Um, you can kind of see that those markings, they're always kind of sticking out of the bone. So see how this process is like sticking out. See how the spines are sticking out. The crest again, it's sticking out. Those trochanters, and having those markings sticking out like this from the bone allows muscles to attach, allows ligaments to grab on, and so this is the importance of having those bone markings right here. They are basically a point of attachment for muscles, ligaments. Um, when you see those terms right here, you know that this is where another bone is going to join or articulate, and therefore it's going to help you form joints. So whenever you see head, the term head, or the term facet, condyle, you know that another bone is going to articulate right there, and you know that you're going to have a joint. Some terms that would mean an opening, and usually those openings allows blood vessels and nerves to pass through. So whenever you see the term fissure means a narrow slit-like opening. Whenever you see the term foramen or foramina for plural, it means a round hole, a round opening. When you see the term meatus, again, it's like a passageway. Fossa, it's usually like a indentation. It's like a depression. So it's not really an opening. It's more of a basin-like depression in a bone. And whenever you see any of these terms, so fissures, foramina, meatus, etc., those would tell you that blood vessels and nerves are able to pass through those holes. They're able to pass through these openings to get to get, let's say, to this part of your skull, to get to for example, we have optic canal. So optic canal, it's kind of like right here within your eyes, and so passing through that optic canal, you would have blood vessels and nerves to get to your eyes. We talked about how your periosteum and your endosteum have those osteogenic cells, which we called your stem cells. Now, there's another name for osteogenic cells. You can call them osteoprogenitor cells. So, osteoprogenitor cells and osteogenic cells, they mean the same thing. Those are the stem cells. And as we said, those stem cells are going to actively divide and differentiate into the bone cells that are going to help us regenerate our compact bone and regenerate our spongy bone. Now, what are those bone cells that they are going to differentiate into? We call them osteoblasts. So osteoblast, osteo meaning bone, blast meaning to form. So osteoblast, those are the cells that are going to be formed by the stem cells, by those osteoprogenitor cells. And those osteoblasts, they are the ones responsible for regenerating basically your bone matrix. So they are the ones responsible for regenerating your compact bone and your spongy bone. So that's why osteoblasts, those are the bone forming cells because they are the ones that are going to help you produce that bone matrix. Now that bone matrix, as the osteoblast is basically kind of forming it, it's going to be unmineralized, meaning that the bone matrix that's going to be formed, it's not going to have any minerals, so it's not going to have any calcium or phosphorus yet. And when it doesn't have any minerals deposited in it yet, we call it osteoid. Eventually, minerals such as calcium and phosphorus are going to be deposited into that bone matrix. But if you still don't have any minerals, we basically call it osteoid. That osteoid usually has some fibers, so like collagen fibers, and it does have proteins that are going to help bind to those minerals. And as I said, having those minerals such as calcium is really important because it strengthens your bone matrix. Those osteoblasts, they are highly actively mitotic, meaning that they divide pretty fast to regenerate the bone matrix, the compact and the spongy. Once the osteoblasts have produced the bone matrix, they reside in little cavities known as lacuna. We talked about lacuna when we were talking about the histology of our bones. So those lacuna, those slit-like openings, that's where the osteocytes, or now we call them mature cells, reside. Those osteocytes are, they act as sensors. So they sense if anything is changing about the bone matrix, and they can send signals so that your osteoblasts can regenerate more bone matrix, or they can actually send signals to break down the bone matrix. So we said that your osteoblasts help build the bone matrix. We actually have another set of cells known as osteoclasts. Osteoclasts, they basically do the opposite. They break down your bone matrix. So they basically help destroy the bone. You might be wondering, why in the world would I want to be destroying and breaking down my own bone matrix? One example where your body would actually go ahead and activate your osteoclasts to break down your bone matrix is when your blood calcium level is low. We said that your bones store calcium. And so if your calcium levels in your blood is pretty low, your body would want to increase the calcium level in your blood. So what would your body do? It would actually activate your osteoclasts, and your osteoclasts will break down the bone matrix so that you can release the calcium in your bloodstream. And so that's why it's pretty important to make sure that you have enough calcium in your diet so that your bones won't break down to get the correct amount of calcium needed. If we look at compact bone is also called lamellar bone. And the reason why it's called lamellar bone, because when you look at it under the microscope, you notice that it looks like a tree trunk. And kind of that tree trunk look is made out of what we call lamella rings. So you can see right here the lamella rings. So this is one, that's the second one, and that's the third one. Those lines that you are seeing within the lamella, those are actually representing collagen fibers. And you notice that the collagen fibers within each lamella, they are going in separate directions or in opposite directions, and that can actually prevent twisting and can withstand stress. So here is another view. So you have, here's the bone, and you're kind of zooming in on the inside right here of the bone. So you can see that near the edge you have the compact bone. The deeper you go into the bone, this is where you're going to have the spongy bone. We already talked about how the compact bone is surrounded by that connective tissue membrane known as the periosteum. So here is the periosteum right here. You can see that the blood vessels are going to be passing through the periosteum, and the blood vessels are going to make their way into the compact bone and eventually into the spongy bone. Because the bone matrix of the compact bone is very tough, the compact bone has those longitudinal canals. We call them central canals. And you can kind of actually see here it is, the central canal. It's actually in the center of those osteons that you are seeing right here. And so basically those central canals are basically passageways for blood vessels and nerves to pass through the bone. You can see also that those central canals, they kind of divert, and you have those perpendicular canals, and those canals right here, they're kind of going horizontal. Those are known as the perforating canals, or you can refer to them as the Volkmann's canals. You can see that the spongy bone doesn't really need canals because the spongy bone, it's all porous, and so the blood vessels and nerves are just going to make their way through those pores within the spongy bone. If we zoom in on the compact bone, as I said, you see that tree trunk look, and those structures right here are known as the osteons. Each osteon is made up of those lamella rings. It's the bone matrix, and it's kind of structured in circular rings known as lamella. If we zoom in, you will notice that there are those little cavities known as the lacuna, and this is where the osteocytes are going to reside. We're going to talk about how we develop our bones. So the process of developing our bones is known as ossification or osteogenesis. That starts during the second month of development, and it continues even after birth. So when babies are born, it's not that they are through with the ossification process. Absolutely not. They are going to continue the ossification process. We are also going to talk about how we go through bone remodeling and repair throughout our lifetime. So as I was saying, your compact bone, like we regenerate it every 10 years. Our spongy bone, we regenerate it every 3 to 4 years. We're also going to talk about the process of how your bones grow in length and how they grow in width. So let's go ahead and get started. So there are two types of ossification. One more time, ossification meaning the process of making bones. We have what's known as the endochondral ossification and the intramembranous ossification. Let's break the word down. Endo meaning inside, chondral meaning cartilage. So this type of ossification actually starts off with a piece of cartilage. So we actually start off with a piece of hyaline cartilage, and that piece of cartilage is actually going to go through so many changes that we are going to see together, and it turns into bone. So that's why we call it endochondral ossification. Because we're starting with a piece of cartilage and it turns into bone. And this is actually most of our skeletal bones go through that process of endochondral ossification. Now, when it comes to making our clavicles, which are basically your collarbones, and your cranial bones, which are the bones of your skull, your clavicles and your cranial bones, they go through a process known as the intramembranous ossification. Intra meaning within. Membranous, you're starting off with a piece of membrane. So we actually start off with a piece of fibrous connective tissue, and that fibrous connective tissue goes through changes and it turns into bone, and this is how we develop our clavicles and our cranial bones. All of the rest of your other skeletal bones, they go through the endochondral ossification. So let's start explaining the process of the endochondral ossification. So again, this is the most common ossification process we go through. So let's say we want to develop our arm bone. So before birth, we are actually going to have, kind of like in the same location where you would have your arm, you would actually have a piece of cartilage. So you would have a piece of hyaline cartilage. Cartilage, it's going to have cartilage cells, which are the chondrocytes. Okay, so since it's cartilage, it's going to have some chondrocytes. Now what happens is, surrounding the cartilage, remember how we talked about there's a layer known as the perichondrium surrounding the cartilage? That perichondrium, it's going to turn into periosteum. We're not going to go into the details of how that happens, but that perichondrium layer surrounding the cartilage is actually going to turn into periosteum. We already talked about the periosteum. Remember how we said the periosteum has two layers, that outer fibrous layer and the inner layer that has stem cells? Now those stem cells within the periosteum, they're actually going to differentiate into the osteoblasts. And what are the osteoblasts going to start doing? Well, the osteoblasts are going to start puffing out and like making the bone matrix. So you end up with something that kind of starts looking like bone, and we call it like the bone collar right here on the sides. Okay, then what happens, the cartilage itself starts to calcify. What is calcify means? It means that the cartilage is going to start having calcium deposited inside of it. And what happens is, remember how we said we need calcium in our bones because it makes our bones stronger? So when calcium gets deposited in the cartilage is going to start kind of getting tougher, and that's not good for the cartilage. You never want your cartilage to be tough. Like, cartilage is supposed to absorb the shock, and it's mostly made out of water. And so when cartilage calcifies, the cartilage cells are actually going to start dying, because when it becomes kind of tough on the inside, the nutrients are going to have a hard time reaching the cartilage, and so the cartilage cells are actually going to start dying. Now, when the cartilage cells start to die, they're going to leave behind a gap. So, like, because you're having no cartilage in these regions, so you're going to start having areas where your cartilage is deteriorating, and you're going to start having a gap. This middle region now, where you're going to start having a gap, what's going to happen is blood vessels are going to start penetrating through the periosteum, and those blood vessels are going to carry some of the osteoblasts, and the osteoblasts are going to start puffing out more bone matrix on the inside. And you're going to start developing spongy bone on the inside. Now, this region right here, we refer to it as the primary ossification center, because this is kind of the area where we are, as we are developing spongy bone in this region, it's going to start getting the form and getting the look of a bone, and so that's why we start calling it the primary ossification center. So one more time, the osteoblasts are going to come in and they're going to start puffing out the bony matrix. It's going to start looking like spongy bone. And then what happens is some of that spongy bone on the sides, they're actually going to turn into compact bone. So the structure is going to become a bit different, and it's going to start looking like compact bone. So you're going to have compact bone on the sides, and now you have spongy bone on the inside. Now, if this is my arm, we know that within the shaft of our arms, we have the medullary cavity. And you've already deposited spongy bone on the inside. So right now, this whole entire region is filled up with spongy bone. Now, for you to have a cavity, you actually need to break down some of that spongy bone that you that was just deposited. And so which cells are going to come in to break down some of that spongy bone that was just deposited? The osteoclasts. So the osteoclasts come in, and the osteoclasts are going to break down some of the spongy bone matrix that was just deposited by the osteoblasts. And again, the reason why they're coming in and breaking down some of that bony matrix so that you can end up with the medullary cavity. At the same time, we have the epiphyses, which are the ends right here, the bone ends, and kind of same thing is happening. The periosteum right here, blood vessels are going to penetrate through the periosteum. Those blood vessels are carrying the osteoblasts. The osteoblasts are going to come in and they're going to start puffing out the bony matrix right here on the ends, and it's going to start looking like spongy bone. And we call the bone ends our secondary ossification center. And this is going to continue happening, and you're going to have more and more spongy bone right here on the inside. And near the edges, it's going to look like compact bones. It's going to go through some structural changes, and it's going to start looking like compact bone right here. Now, this is going to continue happening. So by birth, this is how your bones are going to look like. Okay, so here, this is by birth. So notice how by birth we are not done. Like, we still have a lot of blue, which means we still have a lot of cartilage. So it's not really quite done yet. And so throughout, like, you know, childhood and adolescence, the bones are still going to continue its ossification process, and you're still going to continue ossifying and breaking down a lot of the cartilage that's still left, and it's going to turn into bone right here. As you can see, we're turning it more and more into bone every day. Now notice how by adolescence, so when you're like a teenager, you still actually have a part of that epiphyseal plate. It's basically a piece of the cartilage. See how, again, like we started off basically with cartilage, right? And bit by bit and slowly we are, like, you know, your body was changing that cartilage and switching it into bone. But what happens is during our adolescence years, we still have that piece of cartilage right here, that epiphyseal plate. That epiphyseal plate is actually going to be called our growth plate. And this is actually extremely important because this is what's going to help us grow taller. And we're going to explain the process of how that piece of cartilage is actually going to help us grow taller. The cartilage right here, that articular cartilage, is going to be kept. So this piece of articular cartilage, it's not going to turn into bone, because that piece of cartilage is pretty important, because that's what's going to prevent your bones from rubbing against each other when we have another bone articulating with it. So basically, you need it for your joints. And so that's basically the process of the endochondral ossification. We start off with a piece of cartilage. That piece of cartilage is going to start deteriorating, and the cartilage cells are going to start dying. Osteoblasts are going to come in. They're going to start puffing out the bony matrix. That bony matrix is going to start getting the look of the spongy bone on the inside, and on the outside it's going to start looking like a compact bone. And this is happening throughout the whole entire bone. During childhood and adolescence years, that growth plate right here is going to help us grow taller. So let's talk about the other ossification process. The other process, known as intramembranous ossification, that's the ossification process that's going to take place to develop our clavicles, which are your collarbones, and the skull bones, the cranial bones. We start off with a piece of membranous connective tissue. Within that connective tissue, we have some stem cells known as the mesenchymal cells. Those mesenchymal cells, they cluster together and they start differentiating. So they start kind of turning into osteoblasts. Once you get osteoblasts, those osteoblasts are the ones responsible for puffing out the bony matrix. So you can kind of see they're puffing out the bony matrix right here. As they produce that bony matrix, we call it osteoid because it doesn't still have any minerals deposited in it. Some of those osteoblasts are going to start residing in those little cavities right here, and so we start calling them osteocytes. That bony matrix starts going through some changes and some structural change, and it starts looking more and more like spongy bone. And then we're going to go through some more structural change, and right here on the sides, it's going to start looking more and more like compact bone. So you end up with 2 layers of compact bone, one on each side, and you're going to have the spongy bone trapped in the middle. The blood vessels, as you can see, have already penetrated through your spongy bone, and they're also going to be able to penetrate definitely through your compact bone as well, through those canals that are going to develop within your compact bone. You're going to have the layers of periosteum surrounding your compact bone on each side. Now, when a baby is born, as we said, their cranial bones to develop, their cranial bones are going to have to go through this process right here. So when a baby is born, you will notice that if you touch the top of their head, it is still soft because that process, that intramembranous ossification process, is not quite done yet. Meaning that the cranial bones are not completely ossified. You still have parts that are not ossified yet, and you still have tissue. And so therefore, as the baby grows, this process is going to continue taking place until the cranial bones completely ossify and the skull basically completely ossifies and hardens.